Hey everybody, thank you for joining me. Thank you for your kindness in paying attention. As I often am these days, I'm trying to relax a little bit here. I am in the midst of a variety of deeply conflicting imperatives. Perspectives, ideas, concerns, dreams, and grievances. I suspect that I'd not far miss the mark if I suggested that this is familiar to you. Ironically, I'm standing at this moment in something that I can absolutely depend on the truthfulness of. I'm physically in the context right now, even though it was intentionally framed and assembled by humans. I'm standing in a living place. And I consider living places not merely the arbiters of truth, but the embodiments, the expressions, the instancing of a kind of truthfulness a degree of completely trustworthy presence that language and ideas cannot approach. I don't pretend to complete understanding. And in fact, there are faculties proximal and appropriate to our humanity that profoundly and perhaps even divinely comprise a superposition far above ideas and concepts and language and qualities and naming and distinctions. And even though I am nervous, I find this comforting. The living places are not verbal. And very few of the animals, other than our species, depend upon language, which is inherently deceptive, to enact their essential natures, their beingness. Yet, for reasons which are very complex and historical, our species entrusts precious, irrevocable aspects of our essence to constructs, to language, to concepts, to institutions. And whether or not there may be actual gods or divine beings, and it's my direct experience that there is something that resembles this category very closely enough. Language and institutions, constructs, including machines, including even the device upon which I forge this recording, have in fact invaded the interiority of our humanity collectively and individually. And these processes have leveled up dramatically in recent decades, and now comprise a threat so malignant and sophisticated that it could never have been forged on purpose, though purpose is always involved in constructing it and in our submission to it. Sometimes when the pace of my talk is slower, I gain something resembling liberty. Because instead of following the sort of train tracks of my habits and agenda, I can listen for the otherwise overwhelmed signals of my heart or my soul, my essence. This place, this moment, these circumstances, right here, right now. Those of you who are familiar with my work or are personal friends know that I often present, in other words, my outward-facing costume resembles a modestly advanced intellectual or philosopher. But long before that, I am human, and before that, I am an organism, and before that, I am the living expression of the history and future of life on Earth, of life itself, and perhaps of origin itself, of that which we often refer to as the divine. And it's interesting that this particular word is commonly employed because that first portion of it, that first phoneme, div, means to cut. And this is perhaps why I often prefer the word origin to divinity. That O-R sound. The word origin is a word whose alphabetics point at communion rather than division, it seems to me right now. And if we get off on the wrong foot, or if we start out in a way that we then have to commit to and continue by dividing things in our minds and hearts, then we ourselves become divided by that activity, both individually and communally. And though I deeply appreciate my intellect and my philosophical inclinations, I've lately come to understand something which should reasonably be very obvious, and yet has not been so for me. That as an extremely emotionally sensitive person, as a person capable of feeling into the pain or experience or emotions of others, real and imagined, even those presented to me by media, the world is not a safe place for my heart. Our cultures are inherently toxic to the sensitivities that are uniquely embodied in each of us as human beings. Recognizing a young Jay with whom I'm familiar. Now, there's a theory that, moving toward the intellect here, there's a theory that some 20% of the humans, and maybe even animals and insects and fishes and plants, are significantly more sensitive that this is one of the peculiar distinctions that is natural to populations of organisms. And whether or not the theory is entirely true, it's useful to entertain it. And some features of it match up with my own experience and observation, not merely of humans, but of living beings in general. And the discovery I made that was very surprising to me was that over time, I developed the habit of retreating from my heart and my emotional core into intellectual behavior, philosophical behavior, abstraction. And perhaps part of the reason is that my developmental history has endowed me with skillfulness in manipulating constructs. What a shock. And when I look back on my childhood and teenage years, I notice not merely my own, but even that of my family, with its unique composition. I notice a propensity to avoid the murky, ambiguous, unprovable, non-courtroom-like mess, flowing waters of emotion and feeling and sensitivity, by switching orientations, by switching to argument, debate. If I've got the word right, polemics. And recently, after having a very emotional exchange, with a family member that was both nourishing and tragic, I found myself in a later conversation being very intellectual, and I felt nervous and unbalanced and kind of disembodied. I felt ungrounded. Perhaps my heart is a bit like the gopher. It emerges from the underground, from beneath all of the observable structure, catches a brief and dangerous glimpse of the world at its surface, and then retreats, covering up the exit, doorway it used to catch that glimpse. And we might suppose that in the relatively cruel brightness of daylight, the gopher is nearly blinded. Its sensitivities were forged in darkness. Not the kind of darkness that represents evil or ignorance. The kind of darkness that's something like space-time, origin. The beneath from which living things and structure takes its character. The truthfulness of living places is trustworthy. the pervasive structural overlays we inherit as participants in culture are not like this. And they present in the guise of mastery or authority, a presentation familiar to us from the institutions by which we're often dominated, if not by which we're circumcised, not merely sexually, but cognitively, relationally, behaviorally, while promoting the idea that these institutions are the heroes of human advancement and progress, which, in point of fact, they never were. I'm fond of the trope that perhaps I invented, though I'm sure others have seen it, of the reverse Pinocchio gambit. The methods and purposes emergent from the institutional narrative that turn actual human beings into constructs. There is in some religions the idea that it's possible to experience while yet alive a second birth, in which we are introduced to the personages that belong to the family of origin with a capital O. And I have some affinity for this analogy because I had the great good fortune or the terrible misfortune or a combination of both in having experienced something that very closely resembles this and was unimaginable to me prior. But I think one of the things the religions are attempting to alert us to is that though we embody the potential to experience this rebirth, or maybe even a series of them, not unlike the instars of a praying mantis, we are also extremely vulnerable to something I'll refer to as the first death. That being the circumcision of our essential human interiority, our spirit, our heart, in preparation to being rendered as a construct, a kind of phony, skeletal, puppeteerable set of functions and fake identities that not only have nothing to do with our origins or our essences, but explicitly contravene them explicitly prohibit them, make them impossible for us to imagine, let alone pursue the active recovery of together. And it doesn't surprise me that we're uninclined, particularly those of us who are not religious, to imagine the malignancy of such a project, because it overwhelms. It's so overwhelming that to even entertain it terrifies the heart. And in order to entertain it, we must also entertain our complicity in such projects, wherever and however they are active or emerging. And so, to the great detriment of all of us, with very few and occasional exceptions, we are born into an interior space that's already pre-filled with the produce of language and constructs and institutions. And since the space gets filled up very quickly as we absorb this from our parents and peers and culture, our souls become occluded and our hearts retreat. And in their place arises things we'd almost always reject. Had this bizarre state of affairs not essentially pre-silenced us. And there are those rare individuals or even families or small groups that somehow manage to at least partly evade this agenda, thus retaining some seed of their originary sensitivity and intelligence, humanity, their essence. And in general, they are revered, but often they are executed. And then we get records in text about these people. They come from every walk of life. They exist in every age, group, and in every epoch. And they struggle to resuscitate and sustain that which the constructs deform and transform into commodities and products, objects, more constructs. We're about 4 months into the pandemic, if if we presume it began sometime in early March. And what's left of the intelligible structure of our nation demonstrates very directly the penetration of the layered array of institutional and ideological and philosophical and intellectual and financial fictions that we've been blinded by, that we've been half-willingly converted to expressions of. But I was very surprised to discover the incredibly obvious to someone who was still alive outside me, to someone who was sensitive and aware in the moment of my speaking, that maybe throughout my entire life I would retreat from my heart into constructs, into language. And if not but for a number of accidents, I'm sure I would have become a scientist or a mathematician. But I made my home in language and music. And I'm extremely thankful for the influence of the latter, because the former is insufficient, and the latter is its origin. When I was little, I liked to sing. But after I'd had this conversation with a family member and had been very emotionally affected by it, I had unknowingly retreated into abstraction and intellect. And someone with whom I was in conversation later remarked on this. They said, "Everything you're talking about is very abstract right now." And that's when suddenly the light came on, the light of insight, and I saw that I was feeling very vulnerable, and I didn't know how to protect my heart. And I was hungry for comfort and care, but there was none to be had. So I did what kind of defensively comes naturally to me. I switched orientations. I switched tracks. And that was a really profound moment of discovery for me, because I could see suddenly this thread leading all the way back into my early history. That I didn't feel safe emotionally in the world of culture. In a world where language can determine my fate. In a world where institutions were poised to rob me of my humanity, replacing that with the skeletal remains of who I might otherwise be and become. And so I learned, as best I could, the ways of the institutions and the language I learned to be articulate. I learned to use my voice musically. I learned to present perspectives and arguments that were deep and rich. And in truth, my heart informed my intellect from its subterranean hiding places, and still does. But over time, the increasing intensity and pace of the invasive malignancy held sway. It overwhelmed me. And I wasn't aware that I was switching tracks, though during the experience I had been reminded of this. During the experience that resembles rebirth, I had been shown your intellect will not sustain that which is primordial within you. And in fact, in many cases, it will or must occlude it. Which is another way of saying that true primacy is not a matter for dissemination or analysis. It's like the living truth of nature. It's alive. It's not a construct. And it's its peculiarly ambiguous essences cannot be transferred into statements or language, though they can be pointed toward in language with great skill or creativity. And song adds dimensions that language denudes. And this is in part why music is so important to us human beings. It can return some space, some oxygen to our felt sense of the moment that might and sometimes encourages our hearts and our souls and our essence to recognize itself reflected in the music and to come forth. Perhaps even to feel celebrated and recognized. To be seen, acknowledged, validated, if only for a moment, in the world of constructs. These things I speak of are wrapped in mystery, the mystery of their origins. And it's a mystery I've long pursued because I'm deeply curious about. this strange experience, strange in relation to all of the other organisms, of being human. And it seems to me an astonishing privilege to be human. In so many ways that I'll not even begin the list. The flavor of truthfulness that the living places present directly to our senses is the same flavor of our true interiority, our essence, our primordial humanity. And where constructs intervene, though we cannot deny the fact of their presence, this thing is right here now. They had to put cement on the ground. They had to kill the surface of the earth to ensure that the soil could support this monstrosity. And it's analogous to what happens with us. We become storage containers for constructs. We're paved over. This thing is absolutely a fact. It's a physical fact. I cannot doubt it is there. But the dimensionality of the truth, in this case, it has collapsed the inherently multitudinous dimensions of living places into and toward complete disambiguation, concrete, limited, factual existence. It does not support life. It's a pure construct. Different from a stick or a stone, because it was manufactured intentionally by humans to evict ambiguity in life. And it's astonishing, yet also completely ordinary, that we've become in general unconscious of this. These are constructs. They are meant to pervade over living things, to supersede them, to dominate them, to transform them into manipulables. And what is it that is so profoundly motivated to convert our humanity, all of nature, our essence, into concrete manipulables. What is it? There's different ways to think about it. But it's the strange, ironic ghost of what we were not allowed or brave enough to sustain and invent together. Communion. Co-being. Symbiotic union. The recognition of self in and as other. The blatantly obvious fact that our world is a tiny island, an unimaginable paradise in what appears to be, so far, an otherwise unfriendly to complex life field of potential from which stars and planets and living beings emerge. We have a little tiny boat, though it seems big from our perspective. It can be obliterated by a single gesture. Forever. And unfortunately, our species, in our profound addiction to and fascination by constructs, is urgently pursuing the mission of silencing the living world. It's this ghost. It's the vengeful, ironic hubris emergent from the idea that our species is special. We are, but not in that way. That our species, to survive, has to make war against the living beings and the living places and our own bodies and our own minds. And do this whole reverse Pinocchio thing. Where objects and dead repercussions of representational activity are seen as precious, and that with which we see is slowly converted into dead tissue, into skeletal remains. And it may seem that my mood is grim, but I'm still passionate. I recognize the likeness of my essence in the living places, in the smallest living thing, in the largest living thing. And of course I mean beings, not things. I recognize the infinite truthfulness of lived relationships and living places as pervading over the kinds of bizarre constructs in language and thought and theory that we are trained to say are true or false. That kind of truth is extremely provisional. It's profoundly circumstantial. But the truthfulness of living beings and places is not. It is infinite. So let us not trade pennies for the accessible possibility of participating in the origin of value itself. And understanding, as we learn to understand these things of which I speak, we can enact that understanding by retrieving the potential for our primordial essence, for our sensitivities, for our hearts, to be safe in the world together, with and for each other, with and for the history and future of all living beings, all beings. We live in a time when the pathological insufficiency and blatant lying that forms the basis of the institutions with which we are familiar is now readily apparent to nearly everyone. It no longer requires, in the institutional dimension, a foreign power to take down America. We're going to DIY that. And that's evidence of the Pinocchio gambit in full effulgence, right? In full flower, the reverse Pinocchio gambit. We're going to do it for them. We're going to take ourselves down for what would have otherwise been our enemies, but now that we've joined their project, somehow we're on the same side. And this is the backwards version of communion, right? We're so intrinsically divided as a nation, which isn't at all surprising, again, because this thing was founded on blankets of lies. Furiously blatant, obvious lies from day one, from before the first move. So that ironic ghost, right, that's inhabiting the between of us, and even the inner between of aspects of our own minds and our heart and our essence, that thing is rising to sudden, shocking prominence. As if we'd half accidentally summoned a world-eating demon. But we didn't have to summon it. In the absence of communion, of unity, of intelligence, of insight, of care, of our heartful essence, we didn't have to summon it. We became it. And I sometimes imagine how confusing this may appear to future generations if our species survives, presuming that they acquire some liberation from all I hear discuss, presuming they acquire some immunity to the reverse Pinocchio gambit and the Potemkin village gambit. Right now, There's a genocide going on in our own nation against our own people, prosecuted by our own people. Of course, again, all the constructs are suspicious, but the irony is overwhelming. And it matches the degree of hubris with which, while standing on a skyscraper of lies, we've been proclaiming our superiority and authority and validity and I guess that's a common result of the insecurity that is natural when standing on a, mountain of layers of lying that goes back to the earliest point we can identify with. If we identify with being American, for example, or Americans. So I'm disturbed and I'm nervous, and there's so much going on I don't understand. Even though in talks like these I try to find some kind of path I can trust to traverse together with you. Not the truth, but something moving in the direction of truthfulness. Concrete facts are the cognitive and an analogy of that storage container, right? All ambiguity has been evacuated, which means there's a vacuum, right? And in that vacuum, what naturally happens is the intrusion of the seeds of constructs and institutions and, institutional narratives and so on and so forth. And that space has to be kept open, right? The power of science and technology was deceptive because it moved not so much in the direction of truth, but in what we consider to be reliable conceptual disambiguation or concreteness, irrefutability. Yeah. And that motivation is poisonous to our humanity and our hearts, because they are incompletely formed. They are arriving into formation as we proceed. And so, when concrete facts emerge in the landscape of mind, it injures that formation and has the capacity to put an end to developmental opportunities while appearing to be the agent of accomplishing them once and for all, right? Finished accomplishment. It's very tricky, this whole representational cognition game. It's very confusing. And whether one's religious or not, it's hard to understand who has a better advantage. Religious people can be blinded in certain ways very easily by their religion. And intellectual people almost start out necessarily blind in certain ways with their religion. And so both of the things can blind us, but what I'm trying to point out is just that it is as if we don't make something that moves in the direction of truthfulness together, if we don't do that intentionally and keep correcting our course and keep sort of checking with nature and our hearts and our essence, then something else therein intrudes and occupies that terrain. And that stuff, it looks evil. It looks like death. And our exposure to the constructs and institutions in childhood, it's like a first death, and there's a second one and a third one and a fourth one. Right? We keep over our lifetimes as we serve these constructs half against our will, we begin to take on their likeness. And after a time, what's left is an easily manipulable puppet. And what is manipulating it is that ghost thing. Now, I'm not saying these things are true or that I want you to believe them. I'm not stating them as facts. I'm offering a library of perspectives. If some of them seem useful to you, take them up for a time and see if they're helpful. If they don't, leave them be. But I think your heart may hear the music that your intellect is deaf to. Or your intellect may hear its reflection and become thus fascinated. That second option is very dangerous, but could conceivably result downstream in you switching orientations and becoming oriented by something the intellect can never encompass or dominate. And perhaps you've recognized in my talk some aspects of situations and behaviors familiar to you from your own life. In ways that might help you to overcome their otherwise significant gravity, right? In ways that might help you to achieve the analog of escape velocity from all that has invaded and evicted our primordial essence, our hearts, our sensitivities, the faculties we embody as potential in humans, but so rarely have the opportunity to fulfill. I trust infinite truthfulness above the concrete derivations of presentable truth. I trust relation over derivation. And I am still confused, and I am still naive, and I am still very vulnerable. But if we shall be vulnerable, let us learn to do so together in ways that allow us to experience and express the precious endowments that life on Earth and the history of our species has hidden within us. Thank you for joining me.